Rain gathered in shallow valleys, where fields were cleared with patience, not force. Settlements formed near rivers and stretches of open land, their walls built from stone pulled close to the surface. Paths ran between them, some well-worn, others seasonal, connecting clusters of homes, burial grounds, and places of exchange. Pottery, weapons, and the rhythm of work moved more freely than language. Authority, where it existed, followed need rather than title. The Illyrians were not shaped by a single power or belief, but by proximity, to land, to sea, to one another. Their customs traveled quietly through craft and gesture, and though few of their voices remain, the imprint of their presence lingers where soil has kept their memory. Between heaven and earth, where eagles ride thermals that spiral upward from crystalline waters, toward peaks that scrape the belly of clouds, ancient Illyria emerges from the mists of time, like a fighter stepping from morning fog. Here, along coastlines where the Adriatic pounds against limestone cliffs carved by millennia of storm and spray, where river gorges slice through uplands like wounds that never heal, a people takes shape whose name will echo through the halls of Rome and tremble on the lips of emperors. Rugged beyond imagination, this landscape defies every assumption about the relationship between geography and civilization. No gentle plains spread like carpets to welcome farmers' plows. No broad rivers meander through fertile deltas, where cities might rise like flowers in spring sunshine. Instead, karst ridges thrust skyward in jagged ranks, their limestone bones exposed where thin soil has washed away during countless winters of ice and thaw. Caves honeycomb these heights, like the chambers of some titan's palace, their depths echoing with the whisper of underground waters that emerge as springs feeding ravines, where survival demands both courage and cunning. From the snow-crowned Dinaric Alps that form the realm's backbone to the scattered islands that dot the Adriatic, like emeralds cast upon silk, this territory speaks of forces that sculpt lands for heroes rather than merchants. Forests of oak and beech cling to precipitous slopes where avalanches have carved scars that will never fully heal. Pine and fir stand sentinel on heights where winter storms howl like the voices of angry gods, their branches bent into fantastic shapes by winds that know no mercy. Yet within this apparent harshness lies abundance that rewards those bold enough to claim it. Alpine streams run clear as crystal, their beds lined with stones worn smooth by waters that never know the taint of distant cities. Fish flash like silver coins in pools where bears come to drink and wolves bring their young to learn the ways of the hunt. Wild boar crash through underbrush, thick with berries that stain the lips purple, while deer bound across meadows where flowers bloom in profusion during brief but glorious summers. Adriatic waters themselves offer highways broader than any pass, their surfaces bearing vessels between lands that would otherwise remain forever separate. When summer winds blow fair from the southeast, bringing air sweet with the perfume of distant islands, ships can ride these breezes toward harbors, where different peoples gather to exchange not merely goods, but languages, customs, and dreams. Winter storms that drive waves tall as houses against unwary coasts teach respect for forces beyond human control, yet also carve protected bays where vessels can shelter, while their crews wait for gentler weather. Into this realm of stone and storm, forest and foam, come wanderers whose origins lie shrouded in the mists that drift across Europe, like the breath of sleeping giants. From the vast steppes where horses run free beneath skies that stretch from horizon to horizon, from highlands where different peaks catch different stars, These migrants carry in their blood the restlessness that drives all great peoples toward their destinies. They speak languages whose roots sink deep into ancient soil, tongues that will branch and bloom into dialects as varied as the gorges they will claim as home. Indo-European kinship flows in their veins like streams converging into mighty rivers, related to peoples who will one day raise temples in Greece and build roads through Italy, connected by invisible threads to tribes that will plant grain across the broad plains of the north. These wanderers possess in their very bones the capacity for both war and civilization that marks the truly dangerous peoples of the ancient world. Their gods demand both courage in battle and wisdom in peace. Their customs blend fierce independence with deep loyalty to clan and tribe. Settlement follows the logic of defensible heights and reliable water. Hilltops that command wide views become the sites of first strongholds, their summits crowned with walls of loose stone that can be rebuilt as often as enemies tear them down. Springs that never fail, even in the driest summers, determine where families will build their huts and raise their children. Caves that offer shelter from winter storms become workshops where craftsmen perfect skills that will distinguish their products in markets not yet imagined. Molten copper flows like liquid fire in furnaces fed with charcoal made from oak that grew for centuries before falling to the smith's need. Red metal drawn from veins hidden deep in rocky hearts combines with tin, carried by traders whose journeys span continents to create alloys harder than either metal alone. Blades emerge from these forge fires that can cleave enemy shields and pierce hostile armor, while tools take shape that can clear forests and carve stone with precision that earlier generations never achieved. Proto-Illyrian words crystallize from the chaos of migration, like ice forming on still water. Delm means sheep, those woolly providers of both meat and fiber that make alpine life possible. Mal speaks of peaks themselves, those stone titans that define every horizon and shape every gorge. Ard refers to bears, those massive rulers of forest depths whose strength and cunning inspire both fear and respect among hunters, brave enough to track them to their lairs. Sacred groves where ancient oaks spread branches wide enough to shelter entire clans become temples more powerful than any structure human hands might build. Here, beneath canopies, where sunlight filters through leaves that rustle with voices older than memory, priests whose faces bear scars earned in battles both physical and spiritual conduct, rites that bind earth to sky, mortal to immortal, present to past. Animal sacrifice feeds gods whose appetites mirror those of the fighters who serve them, blood soaking into soil that has drunk the offerings of countless generations. Combat initiation transforms boys into men through ordeals that test every aspect of character and capability. Young hunters must track wolves to their dens and return with proof of their courage. Aspiring fighters must fast until visions come, then interpret what they see according to traditions passed down through generations of seers and shamans. Those who survive these trials emerge marked by experiences that separate them forever from those who have not faced the darkness and emerged transformed. Ancestor worship connects living tribes to bloodlines that stretch back beyond the reach of human recollection. Burial mounds that crown strategic hilltops contain not merely bones and grave goods, but the accumulated wisdom of those who faced similar challenges in earlier times. Communication with these departed spirits requires rituals that only trained priests can perform safely, ceremonies that bridge the gap between worlds visible and invisible, solid and ethereal. Time has hidden stories too old for memory, but the earth still holds their secrets. At Vashi, where the Karka River bends through limestone gorges that echo with the songs of ancient waters. Copper vessels bear decorations that speak of artistic vision, sophisticated beyond anything barbarian stereotypes might suggest. Geometric patterns that seem simple at first glance reveal complex mathematical relationships when studied by those who understand the symbolic languages that connect terrestrial forms to celestial movements. Novo Mesto yields secrets from burial chambers, where champions sleep their eternal rest surrounded by arms, whose craftsmanship rivals anything produced in the workshops of more famous civilizations. Swords whose blades still shine despite centuries in the earth demonstrate metallurgical knowledge that produced alloys resistant to both corrosion and breakage. Spear points whose edges remain sharp enough to draw blood prove that ancient smiths understood principles of heat treatment and tempering that modern craftsmen struggle to replicate. Iron emerges from bog deposits and rocky veins to revolutionize everything, from agriculture to warfare. Ore that can be smelted in furnaces fed with local charcoal produces metal harder and more durable than copper alloys, creating tools that can clear more land and arms that can penetrate better armor. Knowledge of Pharos metallurgy spreads like wildfire through networks of kinship and alliance, transforming isolated communities into regions capable of supporting larger populations and more complex social arrangements. Trade goods flowing along upland paths tell stories of connections that span continents and cross cultural boundaries that seem impermeable to outsider observers. Amber flows down ancient routes like solidified sunlight, its golden transparency preserving insects and leaves from forests that vanished when the world was young. Northern sources where pine resin, hardened into gemstones worth their weight in silver, connect Illyrian territories to networks that span the known world. Gradishta rise on commanding heights like stone crowns, adorning the brows of ancient kings. These fortified settlements combine residential areas with workshops, storage facilities, and defensive structures in integrated complexes that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of urban planning principles. Walls that follow natural contours, while creating artificial obstacles, blend human engineering with geographical advantages to produce strongholds that can withstand sieges lasting months or even seasons. Social stratification emerges gradually as some families accumulate wealth and influence, while others remain bound to subsistence agriculture and craft production. Combat aristocrats, whose courage in battle earns them followers, and whose wisdom in peace attracts advisors from distant gorges, begin to exercise authority that transcends purely personal relationships. Their halls become centers where young men seek training in martial arts, while their wives and daughters learn domestic skills that reflect elevated social status. Kinship networks binding extended families into clans create social structures stronger than any fortress walls and more enduring than metal implements. Blood relationships that connect cousins across upland ranges provide frameworks for cooperation that enable large-scale projects requiring coordination of multiple communities. Marriage alliances that unite different ravines under common leadership plant seeds of political integration that will grow into regional confederations and eventually into kingdoms capable of challenging established powers. Metallurgical workshops hidden in protected gorges become centers of technological innovation, where smiths experiment with new techniques and materials. Furnace designs that achieve higher temperatures enable more sophisticated alloys, while improved tools allow greater precision in shaping finished products. Master craftsmen who develop these innovations guard their secrets jealously, while training selected apprentices in methods that will give their communities decisive advantages over rivals who lack such knowledge. Greek references to Illyrian peoples begin appearing in texts whose authors regard these highland dwellers with mixture of fear, respect, and commercial interest. Geographical works that describe territories beyond the familiar boundaries of Hellenic civilization mention fierce tribes whose fighters battle like demons and whose merchants carry goods worth kingdoms. Ethnographic accounts that attempt to categorize different peoples acknowledge Illyrian martial prowess, while noting their apparent resistance to cultural influences that have transformed other barbarian groups. Warlike reputation spreads through networks of travelers, whose tales grow more dramatic with each retelling. Stories of highland fighters who can move like ghosts through terrain that exhausts lowland soldiers reach courts where kings calculate the costs of potential campaigns against such formidable opponents. Accounts of successful raids that penetrate deep into supposedly secure territories demonstrate capabilities that demand respect from even the most arrogant, civilized observers. Cultural exchange with Aegean civilizations introduces new ideas and technologies while strengthening indigenous traditions through creative synthesis. Foreign goods that appear in highland settlements spark local innovations as craftsmen attempt to replicate and improve upon imported models. Religious practices that blend outside influences with ancestral customs create hybrid forms of worship that maintain cultural continuity while embracing beneficial changes. Political integration proceeds gradually as successful military leaders expand their authority over wider territories through conquest, alliance, and marriage. Regional strongmen who prove capable of protecting their followers while increasing their prosperity attract voluntary submission from smaller communities that recognize advantages of association with proven winners. Confederations that begin as temporary military alliances evolve into permanent political structures as benefits of cooperation outweigh costs of independence. By the close of this formative period, Illyrian peoples have established foundations that will support centuries of cultural flowering and political expansion. Networks of kinship and alliance that span upland ranges and coastal plains create frameworks for cooperation that transcend traditional tribal boundaries. Technologies that exploit local resources while incorporating innovations learned through contact with distant civilizations provide capabilities that will enable competition with established powers on equal terms. Standing on peaks where eagles soar and winds carry the salt taste of distant seas, where ancient stones bear witness to struggles whose outcomes shaped the political geography of entire regions, Illyrian chieftains gaze toward horizons that promise both opportunity and danger. Behind them lie gorges where their ancestors learned to transform raw courage into disciplined strength, scattered settlements into unified peoples, survival into prosperity. Before them stretch lands where their descendants will test highland-forged metal against opponents whose own achievements have earned them places in the memory of future ages. Wind that sighs through pine branches carries whispers of destiny, approaching like storm clouds gathering beyond familiar peaks. Soon, very soon, these highland-born fighters will march down from heights that shaped their characters toward confrontations that will test everything their ancestors built and learned. What emerges from those trials will either justify centuries of preparation or demonstrate that even the most careful cultivation cannot guarantee survival when great forces collide and reshape the world according to visions larger than any single people can comprehend or control. Across the mist-shrouded peaks of dawn, where morning light first touches the crown of the Dinaric spine, smoke rises from 1,000 hearths as scattered clans awaken to find themselves bound by invisible threads stronger than iron chains. No longer do isolated hill forts stand alone against the world's fury. Instead, confederations of blood and oath stretch their influence across entire river systems, their leaders bearing titles that echo in foreign courts, and their raiders' names whispered in harbors from the Black Sea to Sicily's burning shores. Regional powers emerge like mountains thrusting through morning clouds, each claiming dominion over territories that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. In the northern reaches, where the Sava winds through forests thick with oak and ash, the Pannonians forge alliances that transform hunting grounds into realms capable of fielding armies that darken hillsides like storm clouds. Their chieftains, once content to rule single settlements, now dispatch emissaries to courts hundreds of miles distant, while their horsemen patrol borders that encompass dozens of formerly independent clans. Southward, where limestone peaks guard approaches to the Adriatic's azure waters, the Delmatae build their strength through mastery of terrain that breaks the courage of invading armies. Their fortresses, carved from living rock and positioned to command every pass through which enemies might advance, become the nuclei around which clan confederations crystallize into something approaching statehood. Raiders, who once struck for cattle and captives, now launch expeditions that reshape the political geography of entire coastlines. Along the Adriatic shores themselves, where fishing villages cluster around protected harbors and salt works gleam white as snow in summer sunshine, the Liburnians' perfect arts of seamanship that will make their fleets legendary throughout the Mediterranean world. Their shipwrights, working with techniques passed down through generations of master craftsmen, create designs that marry speed with seaworthiness in proportions that foreign admirals struggle to comprehend. Liburnian warcraft, sleek as hunting cats and swift as striking serpents, become instruments of terror that carry highland ambitions far beyond the reach of land-based armies. In the southeastern uplands, where ancient paths wind through passes guarded by eagles' nests and wolves' dens, the Ardei consolidate authority through marriage alliances that span ethnic boundaries and commercial partnerships that generate wealth beyond the dreams of simple pastoralists. Their markets, strategically positioned where caravan routes converge like rivers flowing toward the sea, become centers of exchange that attract merchants from civilizations whose very existence was unknown to earlier generations of highland dwellers. As populations surge and technology races ahead, old clan systems start to crack under the weight of change. Villages that once acknowledged no authority beyond that of family elders find themselves drawn into networks of obligation and opportunity that stretch across entire river basins. Chiefs who inherited positions based purely on bloodline discover that survival now requires skills of negotiation and administration that their ancestors never needed to develop. Kingship crystallizes from this matrix of competing ambitions and common necessities, like crystals forming in cooling metal. Leaders who prove capable of protecting commerce routes while coordinating campaigns gradually accumulate authority that transcends the purely personal loyalties that sustained earlier forms of governance. Their courts, modest by the standards of established civilizations, but revolutionary by local measures, become centers where young nobles from throughout the region gather to learn arts of war and peace that will determine their people's destinies. Unlike inland powers, seaborne alliances grow in tune with the sea's moods, not the land's. Liburnian chieftains who command fleets of swift craft exercise authority that extends wherever their sailors can carry fighters and supplies. Their domains, scattered across islands and peninsulas, linked by sea routes rather than land bridges, require forms of organization that balance central coordination with local autonomy in ways that prefigure later imperial structures. Hellenic colonization strikes these developing confederations like lightning, illuminating previously dark landscapes. When Corinthian settlers establish Apollonia, where the Aoos River meets the sea, they create more than a mere settlement. They plant seeds of transformation that will reshape indigenous society in ways that neither colonists nor natives can initially comprehend. The city becomes a window through which Highland eyes glimpse possibilities that exist beyond their traditional horizons, while providing Mediterranean peoples with insights into capabilities they had previously underestimated. Epidamnos, rising where another river system reaches the Adriatic, creates a second focal point for cultural and commercial exchange. Here, in markets where Mediterranean products meet Highland resources, new forms of wealth accumulate that enable ambitious chiefs to purchase equipment and services that transform their capabilities. Hellenic artisans, working alongside indigenous craftsmen, develop hybrid techniques that produce goods superior to anything either tradition might achieve in isolation. What once seemed impossible begins to shift as continued contact slowly melts the boundaries between cultures. Highland nobles who visit foreign colonies return to their hilltop halls bearing more than exotic luxuries. They carry new concepts of architecture, governance, and artistic expression that gradually infiltrate traditional practices. Mediterranean merchants who establish permanent relationships with clan leaders gain insights into local customs and preferences that enable them to adapt their products and methods to serve Highland markets more effectively. Coinage systems emerge from this commercial revolution, like flowers blooming in fertile soil. Regional mints, initially copying foreign models, but gradually developing distinctively indigenous characteristics, begin producing silver and copper pieces that facilitate exchanges previously limited by the cumbersome requirements of barter. These metal tokens, bearing images that celebrate local deities and commemorate victories, become messengers that carry reputations far beyond the borders of their issuing authorities. New ways of handling money spark economic shifts as massive as the breakthroughs that created them. Chiefs who control mints can fund campaigns and construction projects on scales that earlier generations could never have contemplated. Merchants who understand monetary exchange gain advantages that enable them to operate across greater distances while maintaining more complex inventories. Artisans who receive payment in standardized currency can specialize more completely while purchasing materials from sources previously beyond their reach. As money systems evolve, a maritime revolution unfolds, with Liburnian shipbuilders crafting designs that will echo across the ancient seas. The Liburner, sleek and swift and supremely maneuverable, combines the best features of various Mediterranean traditions, while adapting them to conditions specific to Adriatic waters. Light enough to be carried overland when necessary, shallow drafted enough to navigate shallows, yet seaworthy enough to venture into open waters during favorable weather. These craft become tools that transform raiders into rulers of sea lanes. Naval technology that emerges from Liburnian workshops incorporates innovations that address specific tactical and strategic requirements. Rams designed to hole enemy hulls below the waterline turn merchant craft into instruments of war, capable of sinking larger opponents through superior maneuverability rather than brute strength. Sail configurations that enable rapid changes of direction allow crews to exploit wind patterns that larger fleets cannot utilize effectively, or arrangements that maximize force while minimizing crew requirements create craft that can maintain high speeds over extended periods. Piracy develops as natural extension of raiding traditions that have sustained Highland peoples for countless generations. Settlements that once limited their aggressive activities to neighboring clans discover that naval craft enable them to strike targets hundreds of miles distant, while returning to home ports before effective retaliation can be organized. Merchant craft, heavy with cargoes and lightly defended, become preferred prey for raiders whose swift fleets can overtake almost any opponent. while escaping from forces too powerful to engage directly. The chaos stirred up by piracy doesn't stop with its targets. It sends shockwaves through entire trade networks. Merchants who suffer repeated losses raise their prices to compensate for increased risks, making goods more expensive for consumers throughout regional markets. Shipping schedules become irregular as captains seek to avoid known danger zones or wait for naval escorts that may never arrive. Insurance costs, where such protections exist, rise to levels that make some exchanges economically unviable. Political ramifications of sustained piracy prove even more significant than immediate economic impacts. Foreign colonies that depend on seaborne commerce for their prosperity find themselves effectively under siege by forces they cannot defeat through conventional means. Local rulers, who might otherwise remain neutral in conflicts between pirates and their victims, discover that raiding activities threaten the commercial relationships upon which their own authority increasingly depends. Raids at sea spark diplomatic headaches inland, dragging in parties with no stake in the waves. Cities that serve as markets for captured goods become accomplices, whether they intend such roles or not. Rulers who provide safe havens for pirate fleets find themselves embroiled in disputes with distant authorities, whose merchants have suffered losses. International relationships that once operated according to established protocols become unpredictable as new players with different objectives enter traditional spheres of influence. The old ways of fighting no longer suffice, and Confederate armies shift to tackle challenges that demand more than raids and retreats. Infantry formations that once served purely local conflicts must now prepare for campaigns that may last months and extend across territories encompassing multiple ethnic groups and geographical regions. Supply systems that once relied on living off the land during brief expeditions require complete reorganization to support sustained operations in unfamiliar environments. Weapons technology advances rapidly as smiths experiment with alloys and designs that address specific combat requirements. Spear points that can penetrate improved armor require different metallurgical techniques than those used for hunting implements or traditional warfare. Sword designs that maximize effectiveness in formation fighting differ significantly from blades optimized for single combat or raiding activities. Shield construction that provides protection against new forms of attack must balance durability with mobility in ways that earlier defensive equipment never required. Tactical innovations emerge from contact with foreign practices, while maintaining elements that exploit indigenous advantages in mobility and knowledge of local terrain. Phalanx formations that prove devastatingly effective on level ground require modification to function in mountainous environments, where traditional advantages of superior equipment and discipline may be neutralized by geographical factors. Light infantry tactics that maximize highland strengths in individual combat and rapid movement develop alongside heavy formations that can stand against the best troops of established authorities. Fortress design moves forward as builders blend Mediterranean ideas with their own traditions to face new kinds of danger. Hilltop positions that once relied purely on natural advantages require artificial strengthening to withstand siege engines and coordinated assaults by disciplined armies. Gate systems that once needed only to slow small raiding parties must now be designed to resist prolonged attacks by forces equipped with specialized equipment and extensive supplies. Fighting at sea becomes a specialized craft, far removed from land battles or the chaos of piracy. Fleet actions that involve dozens of craft maneuvering in coordinated formations demand command structures and communication systems that small-scale raiding never required. Boarding tactics that prove effective against merchant craft require modification when applied to purpose-built warcraft, crewed by experienced fighters rather than sailors and cargo handlers. Urban development accelerates as increased wealth and population concentration create both opportunities and necessities for more sophisticated settlement patterns. Oppida that begin as enlarged hill forts gradually acquire characteristics that distinguish them from purely defensive installations. Market areas where merchants conduct business on regular schedules require protection from weather and theft that temporary arrangements cannot provide. Residential districts that house increasing numbers of specialists need infrastructure that supports their activities while maintaining security against external threats. Craft specialization reaches new levels of sophistication as expanded markets justify full-time devotion to particular skills, while international contacts introduce techniques and materials that enable innovations previously impossible. Metalworkers who once divided their time between smithing and farming can now concentrate entirely on perfecting alloys and techniques that produce superior products for discriminating customers. Textile workers who gain access to imported fibers and dyes create fabrics that compete successfully with products from established manufacturing centers. Interconfederation relations become increasingly complex as expanding spheres of influence create situations where traditional protocols prove inadequate for resolving disputes and managing cooperation. Marriage alliances that once involved only immediate neighbors now span distances that require days of journeying, while involving parties whose customs and languages may differ significantly. Commercial partnerships that begin as simple exchanges of surplus goods evolve into sophisticated arrangements that require formal agreements and enforcement mechanisms. Out of necessity, clan leaders begin to navigate diplomacy with foreign cities whose ways are nothing like their own. Gift exchange that serves important symbolic functions in Highland society must be modified to accommodate partners whose understanding of such practices may be fundamentally different. Hostage arrangements that guarantee treaty compliance require adaptation when applied to relationships between peoples whose concepts of honor and obligation may not correspond precisely. Cultural exchange intensifies as increased contact enables deeper understanding between peoples whose initial relationships may have been purely commercial or warlike. Language learning that begins as practical necessity for merchants and diplomats gradually spreads to broader populations as advantages of multilingual capability become apparent. Religious practices that initially encounter resistance from conservative elements gradually gain acceptance as their benefits become obvious to increasingly cosmopolitan communities. Elite culture develops characteristics that distinguish aristocratic lifestyles from those of common clan members, while maintaining enough connection to traditional practices to preserve legitimacy and cultural continuity. Luxury goods that demonstrate elevated status include both imported items that reflect international connections and locally produced objects that showcase indigenous craftsmanship. Architectural elements that indicate high social rank incorporate foreign design features while maintaining symbolic relationships to ancestral traditions. Religious synthesis proceeds gradually as indigenous spiritual practices encounter Mediterranean theological concepts while maintaining essential characteristics that preserve cultural identity. Deities whose worship serves important social functions in Highland societies acquire attributes and associations that enable them to function effectively in more cosmopolitan religious environments. Ceremonial practices that once served purely local communities adapt to accommodate participants from diverse backgrounds, while preserving meanings that remain important to core constituencies. By the close of this transformative period, Highland peoples have established political and cultural foundations that will enable them to compete as equals with any authority in the Mediterranean world. Realms that began as clan confederations now command resources and capabilities that rival those of established city-states. Naval forces that evolved from piratical bands now possess the strength and organization to challenge the supremacy of traditional maritime authorities. Economic systems that emerged from simple barter arrangements now generate wealth sufficient to support professional armies, ambitious construction projects, and diplomatic establishments that operate throughout the known world. Social structures that once served purely local needs now provide frameworks for governing diverse populations across territories that span multiple ethnic groups and geographical regions. Cultural achievements that synthesize indigenous traditions with foreign influences create distinctive civilizations that command respect from the most sophisticated observers. Standing on the decks of swift craft whose prows cut through Adriatic swells toward distant horizons, gazing from the ramparts of hilltop cities whose walls encompass markets where goods from 3 continents change hands, Highland rulers contemplate futures that earlier generations could never have imagined. Behind them lie the achievements of centuries spent transforming scattered clans into unified peoples, capable of projecting influence across vast distances. Before them stretch opportunities and challenges that will test everything their ancestors built, while determining whether Highland courage and intelligence can sustain the ambitions that success has made possible. In the halls of kings, where bronze shields catch the dancing light of torches, and the scent of roasted meat mingles with smoke from sacrificial fires, whispers carry news that will reshape the destiny of nations. Agron lies dead, his mighty frame stilled forever, beneath coverlets woven with threads of gold, while outside his palace windows, the Ardeaean realm spreads like a vast web across territories that stretch from highland passes to azure harbours. Yet death, that final destroyer of ambitions, has not broken the threads that bind this confederation together. Instead, it has placed them in hands that will prove more dangerous to enemies than any man's sword. Teuta ascends to authority, not as mere regent guarding a throne for absent heirs, but as sovereign in her own right, her eyes burning with visions that surpass even her departed husband's boldest dreams. From the citadel that crowns Skodra's ancient heights, where eagles nest among stones worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, she surveys domains that encompass islands scattered like emeralds across wine-dark waters, and mainland territories, where forests whisper secrets older than human memory. What she sees feeds ambitions that will either crown her with glory eternal, or destroy everything her people have built across generations of struggle and triumph. The Ardeaean realm that falls under her command represents the culmination of centuries spent transforming Highland clans into forces capable of challenging established powers. Agron's campaigns have welded scattered communities into unified purpose, while his fleets have carried fear to every corner of the Adriatic basin. Tribute flows into sovereign treasuries from sources as distant as Italian peninsulas and Aegean archipelagos, while Ardeaean warriors serve as mercenaries in conflicts that span the known world. She inherits not merely territory, but influence that extends wherever swift ships can carry determined fighters and diplomatic threats. At the heart of their reach lies a naval legacy forged through courage and constant reinvention. Liburnian shipwrights, working under palatial patronage, have perfected designs that combine speed with fighting capability in proportions that foreign admirals struggle to comprehend. These craft, their hulls cutting through swells like knives through silk, carry crews whose seamanship has been honed through constant warfare against enemies who have learned to fear the sight of Ardean sails upon distant horizons. Every harbour from Brundisium to Dyrrachium knows the terror that follows when these vessels appear bearing fighters whose courage matches their skill. Systematic raiding, elevated from opportunistic strikes to coordinated campaign, becomes the instrument through which sovereign ambitions find expression. What began as occasional attacks against vulnerable merchants evolves into coordinated operations that disrupt commerce throughout the central Mediterranean. Captured cargoes fund further expansion, while ransomed prisoners provide diplomatic leverage that extends influence far beyond the reach of conventional armies. Foreign merchants who once dismissed Highland raiders as mere nuisances discover that organized maritime predation poses threats that established naval forces cannot easily counter. Intelligence networks that support these operations demonstrate sophistication that rivals anything developed by established powers. Spies operating in foreign ports provide advance warning of valuable cargoes, while identifying vessels whose capture would inflict maximum damage upon enemy commerce. Informants working within merchant communities report sailing schedules and cargo manifests that enable raiders to position themselves where greatest profits await. Communication systems that span hundreds of miles ensure that scattered squadrons coordinate their activities to achieve strategic objectives rather than merely tactical successes. This new kind of commercial warfare goes beyond single targets. It strikes at the very systems that keep enemy wealth flowing. Attacks upon grain ships carrying supplies to Italian cities aim to create shortages that will force political concessions from authorities who depend upon imported food to maintain civil order. Strikes against vessels bearing luxury goods seek to disrupt the revenues that fund preparations, while demonstrating that Ardean reach extends to previously secure sea lanes. Every captured cargo weakens enemies while strengthening sovereign finances that support ever-expanding operations. The strategy behind these campaigns reaches far beyond gaining wealth or land. It's driven by something much larger. Teuta understands that control of maritime routes can provide leverage over land-based powers whose strength appears overwhelming when measured by traditional standards. By choking off seaborne supplies and communications, relatively small naval forces can inflict damage that armies 10 times their size could never achieve through direct assault. Her strategy transforms geographical advantages into political weapons, capable of humbling opponents whose conventional superiority becomes irrelevant when their supply lines disappear beneath Adriatic swells. The more these predatory moves escalate, the harder it becomes to avoid the fight they're leading to. Italian merchants who suffer repeated losses demand protection from authorities who have previously ignored Adriatic affairs as concerns of distant barbarians. City-states that depend upon seaborne commerce find their prosperity threatened by raiders whose attacks grow bolder with each successful venture. Appeals for assistance begin reaching Republican ears as victims seek intervention from the only authority possessing sufficient resources to challenge Ardean naval supremacy effectively. Italian interests in the region, initially limited to ensuring safe passage for their own merchants, expand as the scope of predatory operations makes neutrality impossible to maintain. Ships carrying grain from Sicilian estates to feed citizens become targets that strike at the very foundations of urban order. Vessels bearing tribute from allied cities disappear into sovereign hands that show no respect for traditional diplomatic immunities. What begins as commercial concern evolves into security imperative that demands decisive response regardless of costs or complications. The embassy that arrives to negotiate resolution of these mounting tensions reflects Republican assumptions about proper relationships between civilized powers and barbarian rulers. Coruncanius and Titus, bearing the dignity of senatorial authority and the protection traditionally accorded to diplomatic representatives, approach courts expecting to encounter provincials grateful for opportunities to avoid conflict with superior forces. Their credentials and ceremonial gifts reflect protocols developed for dealing with client kings, whose subservience can be assumed rather than negotiated. Audience chambers, where these representatives present their demands, echo with words that carry implications neither speaker nor listener fully comprehends. Italian voices, accustomed to delivering ultimatums that lesser powers dare not refuse, articulate conditions that would reduce sovereign authority to mere administrative convenience, while eliminating the naval activities that provide foundations for independence. Teuta's responses, crafted in phrases that blend diplomatic courtesy with unmistakable defiance, make clear that Ardeaean sovereignty will not yield to threats regardless of their source or apparent backing. Negotiations that follow reveal fundamental incompatibilities between Republican expectations and sovereign realities. Demands for cessation of predatory activities ignore the fact that such operations provide revenues essential to maintaining the armed forces that protect Highland independence. Requirements for compensation to victims of raids would drain treasuries that fund the very fleets whose existence the Republic seeks to eliminate. Conditions for future conduct that would place foreign policy under senatorial oversight represent surrenders of sovereignty that no proud people can accept while retaining their essential character. Beneath each diplomatic stumble lies a deeper divide between cultures that grew apart for generations. Republican concepts of international law, derived from relationships between Mediterranean city-states, assume frameworks of mutual obligation that Highland cultures have never acknowledged. Sovereign traditions of authority, rooted in personal loyalty and battlefield success, reject external limitations that would compromise the very foundations upon which leadership rests. Neither side possesses vocabularies adequate for explaining their positions to opponents whose basic assumptions differ so fundamentally. The murders that terminate these negotiations shock both participants and observers, with their violation of diplomatic conventions that have governed international relations since civilization began. Whether planned or spontaneous, calculated or emotional, these killings transform commercial disputes into matters of honor that admit no compromise short of complete satisfaction. Hands that strike down senatorial representatives commit acts that make peaceful resolution impossible, while ensuring that whatever follows will be measured by standards of victory and defeat rather than mutual accommodation. Republican response to these outrages mobilizes resources that demonstrate the state's capacity for swift and decisive action when core interests face direct challenge. Legions that have conquered Gauls and humbled Greeks march toward Adriatic shores, while fleets that have swept Punic navies from western waters converge upon bases from which Ardeaean forces project their influence. The machinery of Italian warfare, tested in conflicts that span continents and proven in victories that have reshaped the Mediterranean world, focuses its attention upon highlands that have never felt the tread of foreign armies. Preparations that precede this campaign reveal both senatorial strengths and the challenges that await their forces in unfamiliar terrain. Intelligence gathered from Italian merchants provides maps of harbors and fortifications, while identifying potential allies among peoples who have suffered under sovereign authority. Supply arrangements that must support armies operating far from established bases require coordination of resources drawn from throughout the Republic's expanding territories. command structures that have evolved through campaigns against diverse enemies adapt their methods to address tactical problems unique to Highland warfare. The goal goes beyond military victory. Republican planners seek lasting answers to the chaos that raiding has unleashed. Armed operations designed to capture key strongholds must be followed by administrative arrangements that prevent future resurgence of organized raiding. Diplomatic initiatives that win over local populations require understanding of Highland customs and grievances that Italian experience in other regions may not have prepared them to address effectively. Long-term success demands more than battlefield victory. It requires transformation of political relationships that have governed regional affairs for generations. The first naval clashes reveal just how far discipline can go against foes untested by equal opposition. Republican ships, built for sustained operations rather than quick raids, prove capable of maintaining blockades that cut Ardean forces off from bases essential to their operations. Crews trained in formation, fighting, rather than individual combat, execute maneuvers that neutralize advantages of speed and local knowledge that raiders have traditionally exploited. Superior logistics that enable Italian fleets to remain at sea for extended periods gradually strangle operations by denying them access to safe harbors. Land campaigns that follow naval successes reveal how quickly political alliances can shift when balances change decisively. Communities that provided support for operations when such assistance seemed profitable abandon their former patrons when legions demonstrate that continued resistance leads only to destruction. Fortifications that appeared impregnable when defended by confident garrisons crumble before siege techniques that have reduced stronger positions throughout the Mediterranean world. The psychological impact of sustained defeat undermines authority faster than losses alone could achieve. Siege operations that culminate in the reduction of key strongholds showcase engineering capabilities that Highland defenders have never previously encountered. Republican siege works that isolate targeted positions while protecting attacking forces enables systematic reduction of defenses that might otherwise withstand assault indefinitely. Artillery that pounds walls from distances beyond effective retaliation demonstrates technological advantages that courage alone cannot overcome. Mining operations that undermine foundations, while supply interdiction starves garrisons, create conditions that make surrender preferable to continued resistance. Surrender negotiations that conclude this brief but decisive conflict establish precedents that will govern relationships between senatorial authority and Highland peoples for centuries to come. Terms imposed upon defeated forces reflect both practical necessities and symbolic requirements that demonstrate consequences of challenging Italian interests. Territorial concessions that eliminate access to key harbors ensure that future predatory operations cannot achieve the scale or effectiveness that made this intervention necessary. Tribute obligations that drain treasuries prevent accumulation of wealth needed to finance renewed adventures. Teuta's personal disgrace sends a clear message. Not even powerful rulers escape the fallout when their choices clash with Republican demands. Restrictions placed upon movements and activities reduce formerly sovereign authority to levels of dependence that make future challenges virtually impossible. The transformation of proud rulers into subordinate clients demonstrates to other potential opponents that resistance leads not merely to defeat, but to loss of the dignity that makes leadership meaningful. Victory sets off a wave of reorganization that ripples across the Adriatic, changing alliances even among those who never fought. Territories removed from control receive new administrative arrangements that balance local autonomy with Italian oversight. Commercial regulations that replace predatory activities with organized taxation create revenue streams that benefit Republican interests while providing highland communities with alternatives to raiding as sources of prosperity. Obligations that require former enemies to provide auxiliary forces for campaigns transform Highland warriors from threats into assets that serve expansion. International implications of this intervention extend Italian influence into regions that had previously remained beyond direct Republican control. Diplomatic relationships that emerge from success provide the Republic with clients whose local knowledge and maritime capabilities enhance capacity to project force throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Intelligence networks that develop from these new alliances enable authorities to monitor developments in regions where their interests might face future challenges. The precedent established by successful intervention encourages other potential clients to seek protection while deterring enemies who might otherwise test resolve. As politics shift, new cultural currents flow into the Highlands, slowly altering the fabric of life there. Administrative practices that emphasize written records and systematic procedures begin replacing traditional methods based upon personal relationships and oral agreements. Legal concepts that derive from Republican jurisprudence start influencing local customs while creating frameworks for resolving disputes that transcend clan boundaries. Educational opportunities that prepare Highland youth for service in Italian institutions begin producing leaders whose loyalties extend beyond traditional affiliations. With oversight comes economic integration, giving Highland communities new market access to offset the loss of income from raids. Commercial relationships that develop within frameworks of protection enable Highland merchants to operate throughout Mediterranean networks without fear of retaliation from former victims. Craft specialization that serves Republican demands creates prosperity that makes peaceful cooperation more profitable than continued resistance. Agricultural improvements that feed growing populations provide foundations for stability that conquest alone could never achieve. Standing upon the battlements of Skodra, where sovereign banners no longer fly in prideful independence, where Republican standards proclaim new realities that reshape Highland dreams, Teuta contemplates horizons that have contracted from spanning seas to encompassing whatever small territories Italian generosity might permit her to retain. Behind her lie the ruins of ambitions that once seemed capable of challenging the greatest powers of the ancient world. Before her stretches a future constrained by obligations to masters whose authority she has learned too late to respect. Yet even in defeat, seeds of future resurgence lie dormant in soil that conquest has enriched with the blood of Highland warriors, whose courage earned respect even from victorious enemies. Republican administrators who must govern these territories will discover that Highland independence cannot be entirely eliminated through force alone. Customs and loyalties that have sustained these peoples through centuries of struggle will survive political subordination while awaiting opportunities for renewal that changing circumstances might provide. Where ruling ships once held sway, the sea breeze now carries hints of what's to come. Futures still forming, an uneasy peace between those who must learn to live within strange new rules. The first act of a drama that will span generations has concluded with Republican victory, but future scenes remain to be written by actors whose roles in this expanding epic have yet to be determined. From the wind-swept heights of Pharos, where ancient watchtowers pierce the sky like spears thrust toward heaven, and limestone cliffs plunge into waters that have swallowed 1,000 ships, a new voice speaks words that will echo across the Adriatic basin, like thunder rolling through mountain passes. Demetrius stands upon ramparts built by his predecessors, his eyes scanning horizons that stretch beyond the boundaries of memory. while beneath his feet the island fortress trembles with preparations that will either restore Highland glory or bring final destruction upon peoples who have never learned the wisdom of accepting defeat as permanent. The collapse of Teuta's ambitions has not extinguished the fires that burn in Highland hearts. Instead, it has concentrated them in hands that understand both the strengths that enabled past triumphs and the weaknesses that led to recent humiliation. Where the former sovereign's strategies relied upon raw courage and traditional methods, this new leader brings sophistication earned through service in foreign courts and campaigns that span the known world. His mind, sharpened by observation of how greater powers project their influence across vast distances, burns with visions that surpass anything his predecessors dared contemplate. Beneath the surface of apparent submission, administrative reorganization demonstrates capabilities that surprised even those who placed their hopes in his hands. Communities that had fragmented under the pressure of Roman occupation find themselves bound together by systems that balance local autonomy with central coordination in ways that previous rulers never achieved. Revenue collection that had collapsed into chaos during the period of foreign oversight emerges as streamlined apparatus capable of funding ambitious projects while maintaining the loyalty of populations who see immediate benefits from improved governance. With careful attention to lessons learned from recent defeats, rearmament proceeds while incorporating innovations that address specific weaknesses revealed by contact with Italian legions. Workshops that had fallen silent during the occupation roar back to life as smiths experiment with alloys and techniques that promise advantages over equipment that proved inadequate in previous engagements. Shipyards that had been abandoned to decay witness frantic activity as craftsmen adapt traditional designs to incorporate features that might neutralize the tactical superiority demonstrated by foreign fleets. Understanding of international relationships that transcends anything achieved by earlier Highland leaders guides diplomatic initiatives that accompany these preparations. Embassies dispatched to courts throughout the eastern Mediterranean carry messages that speak the language of established powers while advancing interests that remain fundamentally opposed to Roman expansion. Alliance negotiations that once might have relied upon personal relationships and traditional obligations now incorporate sophisticated calculations of mutual benefit that appeal to partners whose own ambitions require capable allies. The delicate balance between asserting authority and avoiding provocations that might trigger premature intervention by powers still capable of crushing Highland independence shapes consolidation efforts throughout the region. Villages that had drifted toward autonomy during the period of weakness find themselves drawn back into confederate structures through combinations of incentive and pressure that demonstrate both carrot and stick. Strategic positions that command key passes and harbors return to central control through negotiations that respect local sensibilities while ensuring that vital resources serve common purposes. Across the corridors of foreign capitals and along routes traveled by merchants whose business creates opportunities for those wise enough to exploit them, intelligence networks demonstrate understanding of how information flows through the arteries of power. Agents operating in Italian cities provide advance warning of policy changes that might affect Highland interests, while identifying vulnerabilities that skilled operators might turn to their advantage. Correspondents working within allied courts report on shifting alliances and emerging threats that could reshape the regional balance before Highland preparations reach completion. Hidden harbors witness the emergence of maritime capabilities that surpass anything achieved by previous generations of Highland leaders. Fleets that take shape in secluded coves combine traditional advantages of speed and maneuverability with innovations that address weaknesses exposed during recent battles. crews trained in new tactics that emphasize coordination, rather than individual heroism, prepare for operations that will test their skills against opponents whose capabilities have grown formidable through constant warfare across multiple theaters. Beginning as subtle tests of Italian resolve, violations of earlier agreements gradually escalate into open challenges that make renewed warfare inevitable. Raids that initially target only the most tempting opportunities expand to encompass systematic operations that disrupt commerce throughout regions supposedly under foreign protection. Expansion that begins as responses to local requests for assistance evolves into conquests that restore Highland influence over areas whose allegiance had been transferred to Roman clients. These provocative activities reflect sophisticated understanding of Italian priorities and limitations that earlier Highland leaders never possessed. Operations timed to coincide with moments when senatorial attention focuses upon other theatres create windows of opportunity for achieving objectives before effective responses can be organised. Gains that provide defensible positions enable Highland armies to consolidate their achievements while preparing for the inevitable retaliation that bold actions will surely provoke. Growing frustration among senatorial leaders who had believed that Highland defiance had been permanently eliminated appears in diplomatic protests that follow these escalating violations. Messages that arrive from Roman chambers speak in increasingly harsh terms, while threatening consequences that demonstrate how seriously established authorities view challenges to their regional hegemony. The tone of correspondence that passes between Pharos and Italian capitals grows colder with each exchange as both sides recognize that peaceful resolution becomes less likely with every passing season. How quickly peaceful competition can transform into armed struggle when fundamental interests collide becomes evident as preparations accelerate in response to diplomatic tensions. Italian armies that had been reduced following earlier victories receive reinforcements drawn from campaigns in other regions, as senatorial strategists recognize that Highland challenges require prompt and decisive responses. Highland defenders that had been carefully rebuilt during the period of apparent submission emerge from hidden camps to take positions that will either deter foreign intervention or exact heavy prices for any aggressive moves. The declaration of war that finally erupts from this escalating cycle of provocation and response surprises no one who has observed the growing tensions, yet its timing catches Highland armies at moments when their preparations remain incomplete. Italian legions that march toward Adriatic shores carry with them lessons learned from previous campaigns, while benefiting from intelligence that reveals Highland positions and capabilities. Strategic initiative that Highland planners had hoped to maintain slips away as events move faster than careful preparations can accommodate. Experienced armies demonstrate how quickly they can exploit advantages of surprise and superior logistics through swift strikes that open the engagement. Coastal positions that had seemed secure behind natural defenses fall to combined operations that coordinate bombardments with infantry assaults launched from unexpected directions. Supply lines that Highland planners had assumed would remain secure disappear beneath pressure that extends far beyond the immediate theatres of combat. At Demale, the decisive engagement that determines not merely tactical outcomes, but the strategic fate of Highland independence itself, unfolds where ancient stones have witnessed countless struggles between peoples whose names have vanished into historical silence. Modern armies clash in combat that will be remembered as long as humans tell stories of courage confronting overwhelming odds. Highland fighters who battle with desperate determination discover that bravery alone cannot overcome the advantages that superior organization and equipment provide to enemies who have perfected their craft through generations of continental warfare. Engineering capabilities that Highland defenders have never previously encountered emerge in siege operations that culminate in the fortress's fall. Italian siege works that rise around the position with mathematical precision create iron rings that no amount of individual heroism can break. Artillery that pounds walls from distances beyond effective retaliation demonstrates technological advantages that render traditional defensive methods obsolete. Mining operations that undermine foundations, while coordinated assaults test every section of the perimeter, create conditions that make continued defiance futile rather than heroic. Like wildfire consuming forests dried by summer drought, strategic collapse that follows this crucial defeat spreads through Highland domains. Communities that had rallied to support renewed independence discover that Roman vengeance falls heavily upon those who chose the losing side in struggles whose outcomes now seem inevitable. Fortifications that had been rebuilt with such care and expense crumble before advances that meet opposition too weak to slow their progress significantly. Recognizing that continued fighting will only bring greater destruction upon peoples who have already sacrificed so much for dreams that reality has proven impossible, Demetrius himself makes the decision that will preserve his life, while condemning his reputation to historical ambiguity. Flight to Macedonian courts that welcome capable leaders, regardless of their previous allegiances, provides personal survival while abandoning followers who trusted their fates to his judgment. The choice between death with honor and life with shame proves easier to make than to live with once its consequences become clear. How valuable experienced leaders become to powers that face their own challenges. From Roman expansion becomes evident in the reception that awaits the exile. Philip V, whose own ambitions require all the skilled assistance he can gather, welcomes advisors whose knowledge of Italian methods could prove invaluable in future struggles. Court positions that provide comfortable exile also create opportunities for influence that defeated leaders might never have imagined possible during their darkest moments. Concerning Roman capabilities and intentions, intelligence that the exile provides proves instrumental in shaping Macedonian responses to growing pressure from Western neighbors, whose appetite for expansion shows no signs of diminishing. Strategic advice, based upon first-hand experience of Italian warfare, enables Macedonian planners to develop countermeasures that might neutralize advantages that had previously seemed insurmountable. Diplomatic counsel that draws upon intimate knowledge of senatorial psychology helps guide negotiations that might otherwise fail through misunderstanding of Roman motivations and methods. More severe than anything that followed earlier setbacks, Highland fragmentation that results from this second defeat eliminates the last credible center around which opposition might organize. Communities that had maintained hope for eventual liberation discover that their champions have either died in battle or fled to distant courts, where their own survival takes precedence over obligations to former followers. Clan leaders who had subordinated their independence to larger causes find themselves facing Roman authority without effective means of coordination or mutual support. Lessons learned from earlier experience with Highland governance shape administrative reorganization that follows Roman victory. Instead of attempting to rule directly through foreign officials who lack understanding of local customs and loyalties, senatorial planners establish client relationships with leaders whose legitimacy derives from traditional sources, while their continued authority depends upon cooperation with Roman objectives. This indirect control proves more durable than previous arrangements, while requiring fewer resources to maintain effectively. Rewarding communities that remained loyal to Roman interests while punishing those that supported Highland defiance. Redistribution that accompanies political reorganization creates new realities throughout the region. Land grants that provide veterans with retirement settlements, create permanent constituencies for continued Roman presence, while displacing populations whose reliability remains questionable. Commercial privileges that benefit cooperative merchants while restricting opportunities for potential troublemakers create economic incentives that reinforce political arrangements. Supremacy that emerges from this struggle establishes Roman control over Adriatic waters as completely as any sea has ever been dominated by single authority. Highland fleets that had once terrorized merchant shipping disappear into Roman service or beneath Adriatic waves that will preserve their memory better than human chronicles. Harbors that had sheltered raiders now provide bases for operations that project Roman influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while denying sanctuary to any who might challenge established order. Penetrating deeper into Highland society than previous interventions, because it occurs at moments when traditional leadership structures have been thoroughly discredited by defeat. Cultural transformation follows political subjugation. Young people who might have devoted their energies to opposition instead seek opportunities within Roman systems that offer advancement to those willing to abandon dreams of independence. Educational institutions that prepare Highland youth for service in foreign bureaucracies gradually create new elites whose loyalty flows toward distant capitals rather than local traditions. Replacing earlier patterns of raiding and tribute, economic integration creates prosperity for those willing to accept subordinate roles within Roman commercial networks. Highland products that find markets throughout Mediterranean regions generate wealth that enables cooperative communities to rebuild what warfare had destroyed, while funding improvements that earlier generations could never have afforded. Relationships that develop under Roman protection provide security and predictability that make peaceful cooperation more profitable than continued opposition. During this period, religious synthesis reflects political realities that make accommodation with foreign influences preferable to continued hostility that has proven futile. Highland deities that acquire attributes borrowed from Roman pantheons enable traditional worship to continue within frameworks that do not threaten established order. Ceremonial practices that incorporate elements designed to demonstrate loyalty to Roman authority provide outlets for cultural expression while reinforcing political arrangements. Upon heights where eagles still soar, but Highland banners no longer fly in defiant independence, where stone witnesses that have observed so many struggles now watch foreign soldiers patrol paths that once knew only local footsteps. The surviving leaders of scattered communities contemplate futures that offer survival in exchange for dreams that reality has proven impossible to achieve. Behind them lie the ruins of ambitions that twice challenged Roman supremacy and twice suffered defeat that grew more complete with each repetition. Before them stretched generations of subordination that might eventually provide opportunities for renewal, though such possibilities remain too distant and uncertain to offer much comfort to those who remember when Highland courage seemed capable of achieving any goal that determination could conceive. Across waters where Highland fleets once ruled, wind now carries salt spray that tastes of tears shed for dreams that died beneath the weight of superior force and better organization. Yet even in defeat, the spirit that animated Highland defiance survives in hearts that beat with rhythms that no foreign conquest can entirely suppress. Seeds of future rebellion lie dormant in soil that conquest has enriched with the blood of heroes whose sacrifice will inspire later generations, when circumstances again favor those who refuse to accept that independence once lost can never be recovered. Beyond distant horizons, where morning stars fade into dawn's approaching light, other challenges gather that will test Roman strength against opponents whose capabilities remain unknown, but whose intentions seem increasingly hostile. Consolidation of highland domains provides Roman strategists with secure bases and reliable resources for confronting whatever trials await beyond familiar boundaries. Yet it also eliminates potential allies whose knowledge and capabilities might have proven valuable when greater struggles commence. History's judgment upon the choices made during these crucial years awaits events that have yet to unfold in theatres where the consequences of Highland submission will either justify Roman policies or reveal their limitations when tested against opponents who possess advantages that Highland courage alone could never provide. Among the scattered fragments of what once stood as a mighty confederation, where broken treaties lie like autumn leaves upon ground that has drunk the blood of countless ambitions, a final flame flickers in the gathering darkness of foreign domination. Gentius emerges from the shadows of defeat, not as mere inheritor of diminished patrimony, but as architect of one last desperate gamble to restore the glory that his predecessors carried to heights that touched the very stars. His palace at Scodra, rebuilt from stones that remember when kings commanded respect from emperors, echoes with whispers of plots that will either crown him with immortal fame or seal forever the doom of his people. What accepts his rule bears scant resemblance to the confederation that once terrorized Mediterranean shipping and negotiated as equals with the greatest powers of the ancient world. Coastal domains that formerly generated wealth through systematic predation now survive on tribute grudgingly paid by subjects who remember when submission meant prosperity rather than mere survival. Inland strongholds that once commanded respect through demonstrations of martial prowess find themselves reduced to negotiating for privileges that were previously taken as natural rights of sovereignty. Yet within these contracted boundaries, stirrings of renewal pulse like blood flowing through arteries that refuse to accept that the heart has ceased beating. Gentius brings to his truncated realm capabilities learned through observation of how other powers maintain their autonomy, despite overwhelming pressure from expanding neighbors. His mind, educated through contact with courts where survival depends upon subtle understanding of international currents, grasps opportunities that less sophisticated leaders might overlook entirely. Centralization becomes the cornerstone of his strategy for transforming weakness into strength through elimination of inefficiencies that fragmentation has created. Local chieftains, who had grown accustomed to autonomy during the period of Italian oversight, discover that regal authority no longer tolerates divided loyalties or competing centers of power. Reforms that streamline tax collection while improving the delivery of justice create systems capable of extracting maximum resources from limited domains while maintaining the loyalty of populations who benefit from more effective governance. Beneath the surface of apparent compliance with Italian restrictions, armed preparations proceed with careful attention to concealing their scope and nature from observers who report regularly to distant masters. Veterans who survived earlier campaigns against senatorial legions provide training that transforms raw recruits into disciplined formations, capable of coordinated action under battlefield conditions. Arms stockpiled in hidden caches accumulate through domestic production, supplemented by acquisitions from foreign suppliers who profit from the rivalry between expanding powers. Coinage bearing sovereign imagery proclaims authority that transcends the limitations imposed by foreign oversight, while providing practical means for funding expanded governmental activities. Silver and bronze pieces that circulate throughout the realm carry symbols that celebrate traditional deities, alongside commemorations of achievements that remind subjects of their heritage, while asserting claims to legitimacy that no foreign authority can rightfully challenge. The economic implications of monetary autonomy extend far beyond mere convenience, creating frameworks for commercial relationships that bypass Italian oversight, while generating revenues that support ambitious plans. Moving beyond familiar partnerships, these initiatives reveal an awareness that even minor players can tip the balance if they choose their moments well. Embassies dispatched to Macedonian courts carry proposals that appeal to shared interests in limiting Italian expansion, while offering capabilities that might prove valuable when larger struggles commence. Marriage negotiations that link bloodlines to foreign dynasties create bonds that transcend temporary arrangements while establishing foundations for future cooperation. Throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, shifting alliances create possibilities that astute observers recognize as potentially favorable to those willing to accept calculated risks in pursuit of strategic objectives that peaceful accommodation can never achieve. Perseus of Macedon, whose own ambitions require allies capable of providing both combat assistance and knowledge of Italian capabilities, receives overtures that promise mutual benefit through coordinated action against common enemies. The prospect of Macedonian support provides psychological encouragement that enables planners to contemplate operations that would otherwise seem impossibly dangerous. Intelligence networks that penetrate Italian circles provide advance warning of policy changes while identifying moments when divided attention might create windows of opportunity for decisive action. Agents operating within Allied courts report on the development of anti-Italian coalitions, while assessing the preparations that various powers undertake in response to growing pressure from Western neighbors. Information gathered through these sources enables strategists to time their own initiatives for maximum effectiveness, while minimizing risks of premature exposure. Revival that accompanies consolidation demonstrates determination to preserve customs that foreign influence threatens to dilute or eliminate entirely. Patronage that supports traditional crafts while encouraging artistic expressions of national identity creates employment for skilled artisans while producing goods that compete successfully with foreign imports. Educational initiatives that preserve indigenous languages and ceremonies while providing practical training for careers prepare younger generations for roles in whatever structures might emerge from approaching conflicts. Religious observances that emphasize traditional deities and ceremonies provide focal points for communal identity that transcends the fragmentation imposed by foreign arrangements. Festivals that celebrate achievements while honoring ancestral heroes create occasions for demonstrating loyalty that bypasses Italian oversight, while reinforcing bonds between rulers and subjects. Sacred sites that attract pilgrims from throughout the region become centers for disseminating information, while coordinating activities that might otherwise lack effective organization. Policies that encourage domestic production while reducing dependence upon imported goods create foundations for self-reliance that purely governance measures could never achieve alone. Agricultural improvements that increase productivity while expanding the variety of crops enable the realm to feed larger populations without relying upon foreign supplies that might be interrupted during periods of conflict. Craft specialization that produces goods capable of competing in international markets generates revenues that support expanded governmental activities, while demonstrating continuing vitality despite constraints. These trade relationships, built under the watchful eye of Italian control, also serve as quiet scaffolding for future alternatives. Merchants who operate throughout Mediterranean regions under protection provide intelligence while establishing contacts that might prove valuable during future crises. Trading partnerships that generate mutual benefits create obligations that transcend temporary alignments, while building foundations for cooperation that could survive changes in governmental structures. When news arrives that Perseus has formally declared war against the Italian Republic and seeks allies willing to support his cause through direct assistance, Gentius faces the decision that will determine not merely his own fate, but the future of his entire people. The choice between continued subordination that preserves diminished autonomy and active rebellion that risks complete destruction admits no middle ground that might satisfy both honor and prudence. Councils that debate these alternatives recognize that either course leads toward uncertain destinations, whose final outcomes remain hidden beyond horizons that no human wisdom can penetrate. Alliance negotiations that follow the decision to support Macedonian defiance demonstrate both the possibilities and limitations that small powers face when they become involved in conflicts between greater forces. Terms that promise Macedonian financial support in exchange for combat assistance create obligations that commit resources to campaigns whose success depends upon factors beyond control. The prospect of territorial gains that might follow successful opposition provides incentives that outweigh risks that more cautious policies might avoid. Coordination between allies who lack experience in large-scale cooperation creates challenges that test the capabilities that reforms have developed. Supply arrangements that must support armies operating at distances from their home bases require logistical planning that transcends anything previously attempted by mountain forces. Communication systems that coordinate activities across multiple theaters demand organizational sophistication that traditional tribal structures never required. The Third Macedonian War that erupts from these alliances creates opportunities for demonstrating capabilities while testing their effectiveness against opponents whose own abilities have been proven through generations of successful campaigns. Forces that take the field in support of Macedonian objectives carry with them hopes for victories that might restore the autonomy and prosperity that foreign domination has eliminated. Early engagements that showcase improved training and equipment provide encouragement that sustains morale through subsequent trials that prove more demanding than optimistic planners had anticipated. Perseus himself proves less capable of coordinating allied efforts than his promises had suggested, while his resources fall short of levels needed to sustain prolonged opposition against enemies whose own capabilities continue growing through constant warfare. Forces that had counted upon Macedonian support discover that their allies face difficulties that prevent them from providing assistance that planning had assumed would be available when needed most urgently. Italian response to participation in Macedonian defiance demonstrates how quickly senatorial priorities can shift when core interests face direct challenges from multiple directions simultaneously. Legions that march toward territories carry instructions that emphasize the importance of achieving decisive results that will discourage other potential rebels, while freeing resources for concentration against primary enemies. The speed and effectiveness of reactions surprise even those who had observed earlier demonstrations of Republican efficiency. At Skodra, where banners have flown for generations, and where the stones themselves seem to pulse with memories of ancient autonomy, siege operations commence that will determine whether mountain courage can overcome the technical and organizational advantages that Italian forces bring to this final confrontation. Defenders who man walls built by their ancestors understand that they fight not merely for their own lives, but for the preservation of customs that defeat would extinguish forever. Engineering capabilities that besiegers deploy against fortifications surpass anything previously witnessed in mountain warfare. Siege works that rise with mathematical precision create iron rings that isolate defenders from external assistance, while providing platforms for artillery that pounds walls from distances beyond effective retaliation. Mining operations that proceed beneath the strongest sections of fortifications demonstrate how technological superiority can neutralize advantages that natural position and architectural strength might otherwise provide. Within the besieged city, civilian populations who had placed their hopes in leadership discover that their fate depends upon outcomes of negotiations that proceed beyond their influence or understanding. Food supplies that dwindle with each passing day create pressure for surrender that considerations alone might resist indefinitely. The sight of foreign soldiers establishing permanent camps around positions that had never previously fallen to enemy assault provides psychological pressure that undermines confidence in ultimate victory. Betrayal that opens the gates to Italian entry demonstrates how quickly loyalty can erode when hope disappears, and survival requires accommodation with victorious enemies. Whether motivated by genuine conviction that continued opposition serves no useful purpose, or by promises of personal advantage that collaboration might provide. Those who facilitate capture eliminate the last obstacles to complete victory. The transformation of proud defenders into defeated prisoners occurs with shocking rapidity once the mechanisms of opposition cease functioning effectively. Gentius himself, stripped of the regalia that had symbolized his authority and bound with chains that proclaim his new status as captive rather than king, faces transportation to distant courts, where his presence will serve as testimony to the consequences that await those who challenge Italian power. The dignity with which he endures humiliation provides his only remaining opportunity to demonstrate the courage that had inspired his people's final struggle for freedom. His example, whether of heroic defiance or pathetic failure, will influence how future generations remember this moment when mountain sovereignty died beneath the weight of superior force. Parade through Italian streets that displays captured treasures alongside the king himself serves multiple purposes that extend beyond mere celebration of victory. Citizens who witness these spectacles receive tangible evidence of Republican success, while foreign observers gain understanding of what awaits those who choose opposition over cooperation. The psychological impact of such demonstrations often proves more valuable than the material benefits that conquest provides. Reorganization that follows defeat eliminates the last vestiges of structures that had maintained mountain autonomy for generations beyond memory. Territories that had acknowledged authority receive new governmental arrangements that eliminate any possibility of future opposition through traditional leadership channels. The systematic destruction of frameworks that had sustained identity ensures that revival attempts will require complete reconstruction rather than mere restoration of existing institutions. Suppression that accompanies transformation targets symbols and practices that might serve as focal points for future movements. Traditional ceremonies that had celebrated achievements face prohibition, while educational institutions that had preserved indigenous knowledge receive new curricula that emphasize the benefits of Italian civilization over mountain customs. The gradual elimination of distinctive markers aims to prevent the development of identity-based opposition to foreign rule. Integration that replaces previous systems of tribute and taxation creates new relationships that bind mountain communities to Italian commercial networks while eliminating their capacity for independent action. Products that enter Mediterranean markets under Italian oversight generate revenues that benefit imperial treasuries rather than local rulers. Commercial regulations that control the flow of goods and services ensure that prosperity depends upon continued cooperation with foreign authorities rather than successful opposition to their demands. Legal frameworks that replace traditional customs with Italian jurisprudence create new standards for resolving disputes while eliminating the authority of local leaders who had previously exercised judicial functions. Courts that apply foreign law rather than indigenous custom gradually transforms social relationships while creating precedents that reinforce Italian authority over all aspects of mountain life. The systematic replacement of familiar concepts with foreign alternatives eliminates another potential foundation for organized opposition. Service that transforms former enemies into auxiliary forces serving Italian objectives demonstrates how completely relationships have changed while providing outlets for martial customs that might otherwise seek expression through rebellion. Mountain fighters who had fought for freedom now carry Italian standards into campaigns against other enemies of Republican expansion. Their service, whether motivated by genuine loyalty or practical necessity, creates bonds that transcend previous allegiances while providing evidence of successful integration. Standing upon ruins where palaces once housed courts that negotiated with emperors and dispatched embassies to distant capitals, observers can measure the magnitude of transformation that foreign conquest has achieved. Foundations that had supported structures capable of challenging the greatest powers of the ancient world now provide bases for buildings that serve provincial functions within imperial frameworks. The contrast between past glory and present subordination provides sobering evidence of how completely circumstances can change when capabilities prove inadequate to sustain ambitious plans. Yet even in apparent destruction, elements survive that might someday provide foundations for renewal under circumstances that currently seem impossible to imagine. Mountain courage that sustained opposition through generations of struggle against overwhelming odds cannot be entirely eliminated through defeat or reorganization. Customs that shaped identity across centuries of freedom will persist in modified forms, despite official efforts to replace them with foreign alternatives. Memory itself becomes both treasure and burden for those who remember when mountain kings commanded respect throughout the known world, while their subjects prospered through successful assertion of their autonomy. These recollections provide comfort during periods of foreign domination, while creating expectations that future generations might struggle to fulfill when opportunities for restoration finally emerge. The tension between past glory and present reality will influence mountain consciousness for generations whose ultimate destiny remains unwritten, despite the apparent finality of current defeat. Beyond distant horizons, where other peoples continue their own struggles for freedom or expansion, forces gather that might someday create opportunities for mountain revival under leadership and circumstances that no contemporary observer can accurately predict. History's judgment upon the choices made during these crucial years awaits events that lie beyond current understanding, while the spirit that animated mountain defiance sleeps rather than dies, beneath the weight of foreign conquest that proves temporary despite its apparent permanence. Deep in the highland fastnesses, where eagles nest among peaks that have never known the footfall of foreign armies, where ancient paths wind through gorges that swallow the echoes of marching legions, the unconquered clans sharpen their blades and tend fires that have burned since the world was young. Gentius may lie in chains beneath foreign skies, his realm carved into districts that serve distant masters, yet the heart of defiance still beats in valleys where Roman standards have never been planted, and where the old ways endure like granite cliffs that laugh at the storms that break against them. The Delmatai emerge from their limestone strongholds like wolves descending upon scattered sheep, their fighters moving through terrain that breaks the discipline of formed ranks and turns tactical superiority into a liability that skilled opponents exploit with ruthless efficiency. These are not the organized armies that fought in formation battles beside kings who dreamed of Mediterranean empire. They are something far more dangerous to occupying legions, the embodiment of popular fury that needs no crown or scepter to give it direction and purpose. In valleys where shepherds drive their flocks along paths worn smooth by generations of feet that knew no master save the peaks themselves, chieftains gather around fires that cast dancing shadows on faces marked by scars earned in battles that no senatorial chronicler will ever record. Here, among men whose grandfathers fought against Agron and whose fathers served under Teuta, plans take shape for campaigns that will either restore the freedom their ancestors earned with blood or add their own bones to the cairns that mark where brave men chose death over submission. Pannonian horsemen thunder across plains that stretch beyond the horizon like seas of grass beneath endless skies, their mounts bred for endurance rather than speed, their riders trained from childhood to live in the saddle and fight from horseback with a skill that mounted legionaries struggle to match. These descendants of nomads who once followed the great migrations understand combat as movement rather than position, striking where enemies are weak and vanishing before superior numbers can bring their advantages to bear. Unlike the fallen kingdoms that had attempted to meet Roman power with their own versions of Mediterranean conflict, these highland peoples fight according to principles that their enemies have never mastered and can barely comprehend. Ambush becomes an art form that transforms every gorge into a killing ground, and every forest path into a trap that swallows patrols, without leaving traces that pursuit might follow. Retreat becomes a tactical weapon that draws legions deeper into terrain, where their advantages disappear like morning mist before the sun. Supply lines that stretch across hundreds of miles of hostile ground become targets that strike teams hit with surgical precision, destroying wagon trains that carry not merely food and weapons, but the communications that bind scattered garrisons together into coherent strategic plans. Commanders who depend upon regular reports from subordinates find themselves fighting blind against opponents who know the location and strength of every outpost, while remaining invisible to the intelligence networks that serve conventional armies. Seasonal campaigns that follow the rhythms of highland life create conflicts that ebb and flow like tides, intensifying when harvest work is complete and fighters can leave their fields without endangering their family's survival through the winter months. Spring brings renewed violence as warriors emerge from valleys where they have spent the cold months repairing equipment and planning operations that will test lessons learned during the previous year's fighting. Roman engineers who attempt to impose order upon this chaos through the construction of roads, forts, and civic centers discover that their works become targets rather than solutions, drawing attacks that cost more to repel than the positions are worth maintaining. Every mile of paved road requires permanent garrisons to keep it open, while every fortress becomes a prison for the troops assigned to hold it against enemies who appear and disappear like phantoms. Fortification strategies that prove effective against conventional armies fail completely when applied to opponents who refuse to attack prepared positions directly, but instead target the vulnerable supply lines and communication networks that such positions require to function. Watchtowers that should provide early warning of approaching strike teams become isolated outposts whose garrisons serve as bait rather than deterrent, their signals calling for assistance that arrives too late to prevent disaster. Infrastructure projects that consume enormous resources while providing minimal returns characterize efforts to pacify regions where every engineering achievement becomes another burden that requires protection rather than an asset that contributes to security. Bridges that should facilitate rapid movement of troops instead become choke points, where attackers can predict the location of targets with precision, while aqueducts that should supply permanent settlements become vulnerable lines that enemies can sever at will. Colonial settlements that attempt to transplant Italian civilians into pacified regions discover that pacification exists only in official reports, while daily reality involves constant vigilance against neighbors who view every foreign family as both target and symbol of their own dispossession. Veterans who accept land grants in exchange for service find themselves serving longer tours of duty than they had anticipated, their plowshares proving less useful than the swords they had hoped to abandon. Auxiliary recruitment that seeks to turn former enemies into allies creates units whose loyalty remains questionable, while their knowledge of local conditions makes them invaluable despite the risks their employment entails. Roman commanders who deploy these units must balance their tactical utility against the possibility that they might switch sides at crucial moments, carrying intelligence and equipment to enemies who know exactly how to use both most effectively. Efforts to infiltrate highland communities run up against walls of language and deep-rooted mistrust that few can breach. Agents who might successfully operate in Mediterranean cities find themselves hopelessly exposed in communities where every stranger's presence requires explanation, and where ancient kinship networks provide security systems that foreign infiltration cannot penetrate. Keeping control across harsh terrain and long distances becomes a major challenge, especially where old systems of command fall apart. Messages that travel between outposts face interception by enemies who understand their significance, even when they cannot read their contents, while the constant threat of ambush makes regular courier services impossible to maintain reliably. Throughout the 1st century BC, this grinding conflict of attrition consumes resources that Rome can ill afford, while providing negligible returns in terms of security, revenue, or strategic advantage. Veterans who serve multiple tours in Highland campaigns develop a grudging respect for opponents whose fighting skills rival anything they have encountered in Gaul or Germany, while civilian officials struggle to extract taxes from populations that exist in a state of chronic hostility. Diplomatic efforts that attempt to buy peace through negotiation founder upon fundamental incompatibilities between Roman concepts of provincial governance and Highland customs of local autonomy that have never acknowledged external oversight as legitimate. Chiefs who might be willing to accept nominal submission refuse to provide the hostages, tribute, and service that treaties typically require, while negotiators lack power to grant the degree of self-rule that Highland peoples consider essential to any acceptable agreement. Economic pressure that targets the foundations of Highland prosperity proves more effective than direct action in many regions, as oversight over trade routes enables officials to strangle local economies by preventing the exchange of Highland products for manufactured goods that communities cannot produce themselves. This pressure creates hardships that gradually erode support for continued hostility, while offering incentives for cooperation that threats alone could never provide. Punitive expeditions that follow successful raids demonstrate determination to exact retribution for attacks against installations and personnel. Yet these operations often cost more than they accomplish, while providing Highland fighters with opportunities to study tactical methods and equipment at close range. Burned villages and slaughtered livestock create martyrs rather than deterrents, while surviving attackers carry detailed intelligence back to their leaders. The Great Revolt that erupts in AD 6 represents the culmination of decades of accumulated grievances and growing coordination between previously independent Highland peoples, who have learned to subordinate local rivalries to shared hatred of foreign occupation. What begins as scattered uprisings quickly coalesces into organized opposition, that threatens to sweep Roman oversight from vast regions that had never been truly pacified, despite official claims of provincial status. Bateau, the Brucian, emerges as one focal point for this explosion of coordinated fury, his name becoming synonymous with the hope that Highland courage might yet prove capable of expelling foreign armies from ancestral lands. His leadership demonstrates understanding of both traditional Highland combat and the innovations that contact with Roman methods has made possible, creating hybrid strategies that maximize indigenous advantages while neutralizing enemy strengths. Simultaneously, Bateau, the Dizitiate, provides alternative leadership that appeals to different segments of the uprising, while creating coordination challenges that both strengthen and weaken the overall insurrection. The rivalry between these two leaders reflects deeper tensions within Highland society, while demonstrating the vitality that enables diverse communities to generate multiple sources of effective opposition despite their fragmentation. Coordination between rebel units that had previously operated independently creates unprecedented challenges for commanders, who find themselves facing opponents whose capabilities exceed anything their training and experience had prepared them to handle. Combined operations that bring together fighters from multiple clans create armies large enough to challenge field legions, while maintaining the mobility and local knowledge that give Highland fighters their primary advantages. Tactical innovations that emerge from this coordinated uprising incorporate lessons learned from decades of observing Roman methods, while adapting traditional Highland combat to exploit weaknesses that conventional opponents had never possessed the skill or motivation to target. Assault techniques that enable Highland armies to reduce fortifications, turn the tables on occupying legions that had relied upon their defensive positions for security against elusive enemies. Rome's response to this crisis requires redeployment of legions from multiple theatres, while demonstrating the enormous resources that effective pacification of Highland regions demands. Armies that march toward the centres of insurrection carry with them not merely weapons and supplies, but the accumulated experience of generations of frontier conflict that has taught commanders how to adapt their methods to unconventional opponents. Tiberius himself assumes command of operations that will determine whether Roman oversight can survive the most serious challenge it has yet faced in these regions. His presence demonstrates the importance that imperial leadership places upon successful resolution of conflicts that threaten to spread beyond their current boundaries, while inspiring other subject peoples to test resolve through their own uprisings. Casualty figures that mount as the campaign progresses reveal the true cost of pacifying opponents who fight with the desperation of people defending their homeland against foreign invaders. Losses that include entire auxiliary units and substantial numbers of legionaries demonstrate that Highland fighters have learned to inflict damage that earlier generations of rebels never achieved, despite their courage and determination. Strategic coordination that enables Roman forces to operate effectively, despite the challenges posed by terrain and enemy tactics, reflects improvements in logistics and communication that years of Highland conflict have made necessary. Supply systems that maintain armies operating far from their bases, while under constant attack from enemies who target vulnerable wagon trains, represent technological and organizational achievements that few contemporary observers fully appreciate. Engineering capabilities that Roman forces deploy during this campaign surpass anything previously attempted in Highland combat, as specialists adapt their techniques to address fortifications that combine natural advantages with defensive innovations, learned through observation of Roman methods. The systematic reduction of rebel strongholds demonstrates how superior resources and organization can eventually overcome even the most determined opposition when applied with sufficient persistence and skill. Alongside direct strikes, Psychological tactics work to wear down the resolve of populations hardened by long years of war, while offering surrender terms that seem better than fighting a losing battle. Clemency extended to rebels who abandon their cause provides alternatives to death or slavery, while creating precedents that encourage others to seek similar accommodations. The capture of both Bartos eliminates the leadership that had provided coordination and inspiration for the insurrection, while demonstrating to remaining resistors that even their most capable leaders cannot ultimately succeed against the resources that Rome can deploy when imperial interests face serious threats. The destruction of rebel armies that had represented the culmination of Highland development ensures that future uprisings will require complete reconstruction rather than continuation of existing organizational structures. Reorganization that follows the suppression of this uprising creates governmental arrangements designed to prevent future coordination between Highland peoples while providing more effective mechanisms for extracting resources and maintaining order. The formal division of regions into separate provinces eliminates traditional relationships between allied clans while placing each area under direct Roman oversight. Systematic pacification that accompanies this reorganization targets not merely active resistors, but the cultural foundations that have sustained Highland opposition to foreign rule. Educational initiatives that prepare young Highland dwellers for service within imperial bureaucracies create new elite classes whose advancement depends upon cooperation with Roman officials rather than preservation of traditional autonomy. Settlement programs that introduce Roman colonists into strategic locations throughout Highland regions create permanent constituencies for imperial oversight, while displacing indigenous populations from lands their ancestors had occupied for generations beyond memory. These demographic changes alter the fundamental character of Highland society while creating new social relationships that reinforce Roman dominance. By replacing local Highland customs with Roman law, the new legal order strips away a key source of resistance while shifting control of justice from local hands to imperial authority. Courts that apply Roman law gradually transform social relationships while establishing precedents that legitimize Roman dominance over all aspects of Highland life. Standing upon peaks where eagles still soar, but where Roman eagles now perch beside them, where ancient stones bear witness to struggles that have reshaped the geography of entire regions, observers can measure the magnitude of transformation that decades of conflict have achieved. Villages that once sent their young men to fight for freedom now prepare them for service in Roman armies that will carry imperial standards to distant frontiers, where new peoples await their own encounters with expanding power. Even in seeming defeat, traces of Highland spirit endure beyond the reach of any imposed order. Values that sustained hostility through generations of struggle against overwhelming odds will find new expressions within imperial frameworks, while awaiting opportunities for renewal that changing circumstances might eventually provide. The spirit that animated Highland self-rule has been channeled rather than destroyed, its energy redirected toward purposes that serve imperial objectives, while preserving essential aspects of identity that make Highland peoples valuable rather than merely submissive subjects. Memory of these struggles becomes both warning and inspiration for future generations who will inherit the legacy of those who chose defiance over submission, while learning to navigate the complexities of life within Roman systems that offer both opportunities and constraints. The lessons learned through decades of conflict provide foundations for whatever challenges await Highland peoples, in futures that remain unwritten despite the apparent permanence of current arrangements. As Roman ambitions stretch toward new lands, the challenges faced in the Highlands become a blueprint for dealing with future resistance rooted in local independence. The cost of pacifying regions where every valley holds potential enemies serves as sobering reminder of the resources required to maintain empire over peoples who value freedom more than life itself. Across the valleys, where warriors once sharpened their blades beneath stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, morning mist rises from fields where Roman plows turn soil that has drunk the blood of the last free clans. The eagles that soar above these peaks see a transformed landscape where straight roads slice through ancient hunting grounds, where aqueducts carry water to cities built upon the bones of hill forts, where the children of those who died defending their homeland now speak Latin in schools that teach them to serve an empire whose borders stretch beyond their ancestors' wildest dreams. The campaigns that ended with Tiberius accepting the surrender of the final rebel strongholds have accomplished more than mere victory. They have marked the closing of a chapter in human history that began when the first Indo-European wanderers descended from northern steppes to claim these mountains as their own. No trumpets sound to announce this ending. No monuments record the moment when the last distinctly Highland voice falls silent in assemblies, where decisions are now made in languages that would have been foreign to Agron and Teuta. The change occurs as gradually as seasons turning, yet as inevitably as winter following autumn. Governmental reorganization that follows the Great Revolt's suppression creates the provinces of Dalmatia and Pannonia from territories that had never acknowledged boundaries drawn by foreign hands. These new divisions slice through clan lands that had been united by kinship ties stretching back to the mists of prehistory, separating cousins and severing alliances that had endured through centuries of shared struggle. Where once the Delmatai moved freely between summer pastures and winter settlements, now customs posts demand papers that few can read and taxes that must be paid in coins bearing the images of distant emperors. Within a generation, the hill forts that had crowned every defensible height begin their slow surrender to abandonment. Without the constant threat of warfare that had made elevation essential for survival, populations drift toward the valleys, where roads provide access to markets and legal systems offer protection that clan justice can no longer guarantee. Skodra transforms from royal citadel to provincial centre, its throne room converted to courthouse, where magistrates trained in jurisprudence settle disputes according to precedents established in distant cities that most locals have never seen. The last independent chieftains find themselves facing choices that would have been incomprehensible to their predecessors: submit completely to foreign authority and receive positions within the hierarchy, or watch their followers drift away toward opportunities that collaboration provides while stubborn independence offers only poverty and irrelevance. Most choose adaptation over extinction, trading the wolf-skin cloaks of their ancestors for the togas that mark their acceptance into a world where status depends upon recognition rather than communal acclaim. Linguistic shifts proceed with the relentless efficiency that characterizes all aspects of governance. Latin becomes the tongue of courts and commands, of commercial contracts and religious ceremonies. Children who grow up bilingual gradually find more opportunities available to those who speak the official dialect fluently than to those who cling to local speech that marks them as provincial. Within 2 generations, mountain dialects retreat from public spaces to household conversations, then to the whispered stories that grandmothers tell when foreign ears are not listening. The story of this period unfolds like sediment in a river delta, each layer marking another shift in the current of change. Pottery that once bore distinctively Highland geometric patterns gives way to mass-produced vessels that could have been manufactured anywhere in the empire. Burial practices that had honored fighters with arms and chieftains with treasure evolved toward customs that emphasize family monuments and poetic epitaphs, rather than grave goods that proclaimed the deceased's role in community life. Religious synthesis accelerates as ancient deities acquire Latin names and attributes, while losing the fierce independence that had characterized Highland spirituality. The great god, who had been called upon to curse enemies and bless raids, becomes a peaceful guardian of harvests and protector of travelers. Sacred groves, where human sacrifice had honored ancient compacts with supernatural forces, transform into pleasant temples where citizens make offerings of wine and incense to gods whose very natures have been domesticated by theology. The network of Highland auxiliary units that serve throughout the armies provides one of the few remaining channels through which mountain ways survive in recognizable form. Veterans who return from campaigns in Britain and Germania carry with them stories that blend discipline with memories of clan courage, creating hybrid narratives that preserve elements of the old ways while adapting them to new contexts. Their sons often follow them into service, creating dynasties of professional soldiers whose loyalty belongs to Rome but whose blood remembers older allegiances. Pannonian cavalry units achieve particular fame throughout the armies, their horsemanship skills making them invaluable for reconnaissance and raiding operations that conventional legions cannot perform effectively. These mounted fighters, descended from the nomads who had terrorized settled peoples for generations, now carry standards into battles that extend borders while earning honors that would have astounded their ancestors. The irony of former enemies becoming Rome's most trusted defenders escapes most contemporary observers, yet it reflects the empire's genius for converting opposition into support. Economic integration proceeds through mechanisms that replace clan self-sufficiency with dependence upon commercial networks. Highland communities that had once produced everything they needed within their own territories discover advantages in specializing in products that distant markets value, while importing goods that other regions can manufacture more efficiently. Wool from Highland sheep finds buyers in Italian textile centers, while Mediterranean wines and oils flow northward along roads that engineers have carved through passes that had once known only footpaths. The development of mining operations in regions rich with silver and iron provides employment for populations that had lost their sources of livelihood when raiding ceased to be a viable economic option. Former fighters who had earned their living through the capture of enemy cattle and goods learn new skills in extracting wealth from the earth itself. These mining settlements become cosmopolitan centers, where workers from throughout the empire mingle with local populations, creating communities that embody diversity while gradually eroding the distinctiveness that had once defined communal bonds. Urban centers that grow around governmental posts become magnets that draw ambitious young people away from rural communities where older ways might have persisted longer. The promise of education, career advancement, and participation in the wider civilization proves irresistible to many who might otherwise have remained content with pastoral existence. Those who stay in the mountains find themselves increasingly isolated from the main currents of their time, their voices growing fainter with each passing generation. Legal shifts prove particularly effective in undermining structures that had sustained clan independence. Roman jurisprudence recognizes individual property rights rather than collective ownership, enabling the accumulation of wealth by families who adapt quickly to new opportunities, while impoverishing those who attempt to maintain older patterns of communal resource sharing. Marriage customs that had strengthened inter-clan alliances yield to practices that emphasize immediate family bonds over extended kinship networks. Educational initiatives that prepare Highland youth for careers within the bureaucracy create a new elite class whose interests align with objectives rather than communal heritage. Schools established in major settlements teach reading and writing in Latin, while providing instruction in history and jurisprudence, that gradually displaces oral narratives that had preserved collective memory. Students who excel in these institutions often leave their home regions entirely, pursuing opportunities in distant provinces where their origins become irrelevant to their success. Memory itself becomes a casualty of this systematic change as the mechanisms that had preserved community histories cease to function effectively. Storytellers who had memorized genealogies stretching back dozens of generations find their audiences dwindling as younger people show more interest in literature than in tales of ancestral heroism. Sacred sites that had served as focal points for gatherings gradually lose their significance as communities scatter, and the ceremonies that had maintained their importance fall into disuse. The process of Romanization accelerates during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, as citizenship extends to all free inhabitants of the provinces, eliminating the distinctions that had preserved some recognition of ethnic heritage. Former mountain peoples become simply Romans who happen to live in particular geographic regions, their background reduced to curiosities that have no practical significance in daily life. Local dialects survive in rural areas, but they increasingly become the speech of peasants and shepherds rather than sources of communal pride. Traditional Highland techniques gradually disappear, replaced by more uniform practices designed to appeal beyond local boundaries. The intricate metalwork that had distinguished mountain artisans gives way to mass-produced items that sacrifice artistic individuality for commercial efficiency. Even personal ornaments lose their communal significance as fashion trends spread from centers to provincial populations, eager to demonstrate their sophistication. By the later period, former territories were fully woven into the fabric of strategic planning. Auxiliary units recruited from Dalmatia and Pannonia serve alongside troops from Gaul and Germania in campaigns that have no connection to their ancestral homelands. These soldiers fight for causes that transcend local interests, while developing loyalties that center upon traditions rather than ethnic bonds. Their dedication to ideals often exceeds that of troops drawn from older, more thoroughly Romanized provinces. By the 4th and 5th centuries, remnants of older customs linger only as local oddities, faint echoes rather than traditions that still shape daily life. Social patterns have shifted so thoroughly that former mountain communities blend into the broader provincial population, their distinctiveness visible only through subtle traces like names and places. The rise of Christianity provides one final shift that completes the obliteration of distinctively Highland essence. The new religion offers spiritual frameworks that transcend ethnic boundaries, while providing alternative sources of meaning that replace communal heritage with universal doctrines. Churches built upon sites that had once hosted assemblies welcome congregations that include descendants of former enemies, united in common faith that renders their ancestral conflicts irrelevant. In the final stages of change, Highland dialects fade away, leaving behind only names of places and people whose meanings are no longer remembered. Rivers and mountains retain appellations that echo ancient tongues, but the people who live beside them no longer understand what these names meant to their ancestors. The vocabulary that had expressed concepts essential to clan life disappears as the experiences it described cease to be relevant to populations whose concerns focus upon matters rather than local affairs. By the time Germanic migrations begin reshaping the ethnic map of southeastern Europe, the territories that had once sustained distinctive Highland societies have become thoroughly integrated into civilization. The Slavic peoples who eventually settle in these regions encounter populations that identify as Romans rather than inheritors of pre-conquest heritage. Settlement patterns and farming routines remain steady over time. But what fills these familiar forms speaks more to shifting realities than to clan tradition. Standing upon the heights where chieftains once gazed across domains that acknowledged no master save the mountain gods, visitors see landscapes that bear testimony to one of history's most complete metamorphoses. Roads that still carry traffic follow routes that pathways had established millennia earlier, while medieval churches rise upon foundations that once supported temples to deities whose names have vanished from human memory. The stones themselves remember, but their witnesses speak languages that would be foreign to those who shaped them. Yet perhaps the change was not as complete as officials believed. Beneath the appearance of Roman order, traces of earlier ways may have persisted. The steadfast loyalty of Highland fighters might reflect deep-rooted ideals carried into new roles, while the resilience of mountain independence points to customs of self-rule that survived in quiet continuity. While regimes rose and fell, the communities beneath them held fast, adapting to change without being displaced. The people remained. Only their sense of self changed, as historical circumstances rendered clan affiliations irrelevant, while creating new forms of belonging that served rather than local purposes. In village festivals that celebrate patron saints with enthusiasm that seems disproportionate to their religious significance, in customs that govern hospitality towards strangers, in the stubbornness with which rural communities resist outside interference in their affairs, observers might recognize echoes of attitudes that characterized Highland societies before conquest reshaped their expression. The forms have changed beyond recognition, but perhaps something essential persists in the temperament of peoples whose ancestors chose death over submission when faced with impossible odds. The end of this story thus becomes not an ending, but a metamorphosis, the conversion of one form of human community into another that preserved certain essential elements while adapting to circumstances that made older patterns of life unsustainable. The courage that had enabled Highland fighters to challenge legions found new outlets in service to objectives, while the independence that had characterized clan society expressed itself through participation in institutions that offered forms of autonomy unknown to earlier generations. History's verdict upon this shift depends largely upon the perspective from which it is viewed. From the standpoint of efficiency and sophistication, the Romanization of Highland territories represents successful integration of primitive peoples into advanced civilization. From the perspective of diversity and ethnic autonomy, it exemplifies the tragic loss of distinctive ways of life that might have contributed alternative approaches to human organization and expression. Perhaps both perspectives contain essential truths that resist synthesis into single, coherent narratives. This story ends not with dramatic defeat, but with gradual absorption, the slow dissolution of boundaries that had once seemed permanent and essential. Its conclusion reminds us that no society stands outside history's shifting currents, and invites us to wonder which parts of our world might endure the storms ahead, just as past peoples weathered theirs, only to fade into memory.